Sarah stared blankly out the kitchen window, her eyes fixed on the manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges that lined the quiet suburban street. This was the view she woke up to every morning, a visual representation of the monotony that had consumed her life. She sighed, taking a sip of her lukewarm coffee as she mentally prepared herself for another day of the same old routine. At 35, Sarah had expected her life to look much different. She had always dreamed of adventure, of exploring the world and discovering new passions. But instead, she found herself trapped in a stagnant marriage to Mark, a man she had settled for rather than truly loved. Their relationship had started with promise, but over the years it had slowly withered, leaving Sarah feeling unfulfilled and uncertain about the path she had chosen. As she moved through the motions of her morning, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of dissatisfaction creep up within her. She went through the familiar motions, making breakfast, packing her bag for the commute to work, and kissing Mark goodbye as he left for his own job. But there was no spark, no excitement, just a deep-rooted feeling of emptiness. Sarah's job as a marketing manager provided a decent income and a modicum of stability, but it too had become a source of boredom. The endless meetings, the formulaic campaigns, the corporate politics, it all felt like a never-ending cycle of monotony. She longed for something more, some sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for far too long. It was during her commute, sitting in the sea of traffic, that Sarah's mind often wandered to the past. She remembered her college days when she had been full of dreams and ambition. Back then, she had been surrounded by a vibrant group of friends, including the charismatic and adventurous David. He had been her closest confidant, the one person who truly understood her restless spirit and thirst for exploration. Sarah and David had been inseparable, their bond forged through late-night conversations, spontaneous road trips, and shared dreams of the future. But as life often does, their paths had diverged after graduation. David had set off to pursue his passion for writing, while Sarah had succumbed to the societal pressure to settle down and start a respectable career. Now, a decade later, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had become of her old friend. Had he found the fulfillment he had always sought? Had he managed to escape the mundane existence that Sarah now found herself trapped in? The thought of David's carefree spirit and infectious enthusiasm stirred a longing within her, a yearning for the freedom and excitement she had once known. As Sarah pulled into the parking lot of her office, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for another day of going through the motions. But deep down, she knew that something had to change. She couldn't continue living this way, trapped in a life that felt more like a prison than a home. The question was, what would she do about it? With a renewed sense of determination, Sarah gathered her belongings and stepped out of her car, ready to face the day. Little did she know that the answers she sought were about to present themselves in the most unexpected of ways. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the cozy cafe, but Sarah's mind was far from the task at hand. As she stirred her chai latte, her gaze drifted towards the window, lost in a sea of memories. Just then, a familiar figure caught her eye, and her heart skipped a beat. "David?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Sure enough, there he was, striding through the door, his confident gait and warm smile instantly recognizable. Sarah felt a surge of excitement, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Hesitantly, she raised her hand, catching his attention. David's face lit up as he spotted her, and he made his way over to her table, his eyes sparkling with delight. "Sarah? I can't believe it. It's been too long," he exclaimed, pulling her into a gentle embrace. Sarah inhaled deeply, the comforting scent of his cologne transporting her back to their college days when they had been inseparable. "David, what are you doing here? I thought you were still in the city," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of surprise and joy. "I'm actually back in town, starting a new chapter," he replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I've been meaning to reach out, but life has a way of getting in the way, you know?" Sarah nodded, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "I can't believe it's been a decade. Where have you been all this time?" David's eyes crinkled as he leaned back in his chair. "Oh, just trying to figure out this whole adult thing. I spent some time traveling, then got into freelance writing. It's been a wild ride, but I'm finally back, and I'm so glad to see a familiar face." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest as she listened to his animated storytelling. It was as if no time had passed at all, and they were simply picking up where they had left off. She couldn't help but marvel at how effortlessly David seemed to navigate life, a stark contrast to her own sense of stagnation. "It's so good to see you, David," she said, her voice tinged with a hint of melancholy. "I've missed our talks, our adventures. Things have been—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Well, let's just say a lot has changed since you left." David's expression softened, and he reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. "I can only imagine, but I'm here now and I'd love to catch up. Maybe we could grab dinner sometime, or even just take a walk in the park like we used to." Sarah felt a familiar flutter in her chest at his touch, and she found herself nodding without hesitation. "I'd like that. It would be nice to reminisce and see what's been going on in each other's lives." As they made plans to meet up, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and trepidation. David's return had reignited a spark within her, a spark she had long thought extinguished. Yet, the weight of her marriage and the expectations of her life seemed to loom over her, casting a shadow on the possibilities that now lay before her. As she bid David farewell, Sarah found herself lost in thought, her mind racing with a million questions. What did this reunion mean for her future? Could she truly allow herself to explore the feelings that had once been so strong between them? Or would she continue to play it safe, trapped in the confines of her routine existence? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Sarah's world had been turned upside down, and the future had never seemed so uncertain, or so full of promise. Conversations in the park. The warm afternoon sun filtered through the lush canopy of trees, casting a gentle glow over the tranquil park. Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as she scanned the familiar surroundings. It was here, in this very spot, that she and David had spent countless hours during their college days, lost in conversation and dreaming of the future. As she made her way down the winding path, her heart raced with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. The last time she had been here, she was a carefree young woman, unburdened by the responsibilities and disappointments that now weighed heavily on her. Now, at 35, she felt like a different person, worn down by the monotony of her life, yearning for the spark of adventure that had once consumed her. Sarah spotted David sitting on a bench, his gaze fixed on the ducks gliding across the pond. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips, and she couldn't help but pause, taking in the sight of him. He had always possessed a certain magnetism, a charisma that drew people to him effortlessly. Even after all these years, that quality remained, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she approached. "Hey, stranger," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. David looked up, his eyes lighting up with genuine delight. "Sarah, I'm so glad you could make it." He stood, embracing her warmly. "It's been far too long." "It really has," she murmured, savoring the familiar scent of his cologne and the comforting familiarity of his touch. As they pulled apart, Sarah felt a pang of longing, memories of their carefree college days flooding her mind. They settled onto the bench, their conversation flowing with an ease that belied the years that had passed. David spoke animatedly about his adventures, his hands gesturing expressively as he described the places he had been and the stories he had collected. Sarah listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face, captivated by the way his words painted vivid pictures in her mind. "It sounds incredible," she breathed, a wistful note in her voice. "I can't even imagine what that must have been like." David's gaze softened, and he reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. You could have come with me. We could have explored the world together." Sarah felt a familiar pang of regret, her fingers curling around his. "I know, but things didn't exactly work out that way, did they?" The unspoken words hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the choices they had made, the paths that had led them to this moment where their lives had diverged so dramatically. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice low and sincere. "I should have stayed in touch, kept you updated on my adventures. Maybe things would have been different." Sarah shook her head, offering him a sad smile. "It's not your fault as well. I made my own choices, and I have to live with them." She paused, her gaze drifting to the tranquil pond. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd been brave enough to take a different path. David squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with empathy. It's not too late, you know. You can still change the course of your life. You deserve to be happy, Sarah. His words struck a chord within her, and Sarah felt a glimmer of hope ignite in her chest. For so long, she had resigned herself to the life she had chosen, burying her dreams and aspirations beneath the weight of societal expectations and the comfort of familiarity. But now, with David's unwavering support, she dared to entertain the possibility of a different future, one where she could reclaim the sense of adventure and fulfillment that had once defined her. Sarah hesitated, her gaze searching his face. I don't know what to do. I feel so lost, David, like I'm trapped in a life that I never really wanted. David shifted closer, his thumb gently caressing the back of her hand. Then let's figure it out together. I'm here for you, Sarah. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. His words were a lifeline, a reminder that she didn't have to face this alone. With a deep breath, Sarah allowed herself to lean into his touch, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. Okay, she whispered, her eyes shining with a newfound determination. Let's do this. Together. The weight of her decision hung in the air, but Sarah felt a sense of clarity that she hadn't experienced in years. As she and David continued their conversation, exploring the possibilities that lay before them, she knew that this moment would be a turning point, a chance to reclaim the freedom and happiness she had once taken for granted. In the park where their friendship had blossomed, Sarah and David now stood on the precipice of a new chapter, one that held the promise of a future filled with the exhilaration and uncertainty that she had so desperately craved. Sarah stared at the message from David, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and trepidation. What do you say we get out of this town for the weekend? I'd love to show you some of the places I've been exploring since I got back. The invitation was tempting, a chance to escape the monotony of her life and reconnect with an old friend. But the guilt of even considering it weighed heavily on her. She was a married woman, after all, and the thought of running off with David, even for a brief respite, felt like a betrayal of her vows. Yet, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table, Mark's voice droning on about his work in the background, she couldn't shake the longing that had been stirring within her since David's return. The memories of their carefree college days, the laughter they shared, and the sense of adventure he had always embodied, it all felt like a distant dream compared to the reality of her current existence. Closing her eyes, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to break free, even for a little while, to feel the wind in her hair, to explore new places, to simply be herself without the burden of expectations. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, a siren's call she found increasingly difficult to resist. Sarah, are you even listening to me? Mark's voice cut through her reverie, and she snapped back to the present, offering a half-hearted apology. As he continued his monologue, Sarah's gaze drifted to the message from David, the words beckoning her to take a leap of faith. That night, as she lay in bed, Sarah's mind raced. She thought of the life she had built with Mark, the stability, the security, the comfort. And then she thought of David, the embodiment of the freedom and excitement she craved. It was a choice between the known and the unknown, between the safe path and the uncertain one. Finally, with a deep breath, Sarah made her decision. She would go on the weekend getaway with David. The risk was high, the consequences uncertain, but in that moment, the allure of the unknown was too strong to ignore. She needed to know if there was more to life than the monotony that had consumed her. The next day, Sarah met David at the local cafe, her nerves palpable. I'd love to join you on that weekend trip, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David's face lit up with a warm smile. Excellent. I've got the perfect place in mind. We'll leave Friday afternoon if that works for you? Sarah nodded, her heart fluttering with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Yes, that sounds wonderful. As they finalized the details, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration. This was it, her chance to break free, to rediscover the parts of herself she had long since buried. The weight of her decision weighed heavily, but the prospect of the unknown was too enticing to ignore. On Friday, Sarah hurried home from work, her mind racing. She had told Mark that she would be spending the weekend with a college friend, and he seemed indifferent, lost in his own routine. As she packed a small overnight bag, Sarah felt a pang of guilt, but she pushed it aside, determined to seize this opportunity. When David arrived to pick her up, Sarah felt a surge of nervous energy. "Ready to go on an adventure?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, stepping into the car and feeling a sense of freedom as they pulled away from the curb. The drive was filled with easy conversation and laughter, just like old times. Sarah marveled at how comfortable she felt in David's presence, how the years that had passed seemed to melt away. They traded stories of their lives, and Sarah found herself opening up in a way she hadn't in years, sharing her frustrations and her dreams. As they approached their destination, a quaint, secluded cabin nestled in the woods, Sarah felt a thrill of anticipation. David had chosen the perfect setting, far from the prying eyes of their small town and the obligations that weighed her down. Once they had settled in, David suggested a hike through the nearby trails. Sarah eagerly agreed, eager to stretch her legs and immerse herself in the natural beauty surrounding them. As they walked, Sarah couldn't help but notice the way the sunlight danced through the trees, casting a warm glow on David's face. She found herself drawn to his infectious energy, the way he seemed to breathe life into every moment. It was a stark contrast to the monotony of her everyday existence, and she found herself falling under his spell. At one point, they came upon a serene clearing, a small stream winding its way through the lush greenery. David turned to Sarah, his eyes shining with a hint of mischief. "Race you to the other side?" he challenged, and before she could protest, he was off, his laughter echoing through the trees. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then with a grin she took off after him, her heart pounding with exhilaration. As they splashed through the cool water, Sarah felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in years, her worries melting away as she surrendered to the moment. When they finally reached the other side, breathless and grinning, Sarah found herself drawn to David. Their eyes locked in a silent exchange. The air crackled with an undeniable tension, and for a moment, Sarah felt as if the world had stopped, leaving only the two of them in this enchanted clearing. Slowly, David reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Sarah's face, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice low and intimate, "I'm so glad you're here with me." In that moment, Sarah knew there was no going back. She had crossed a line, and the consequences, whatever they may be, were hers to face. But as she looked into David's eyes, she couldn't find the strength to care. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Sarah's heart raced as she stared at the message on her phone, the words blurring together. It was from David, a simple invitation to meet for coffee, but the implications were anything but simple. She had carefully guarded her growing feelings for him, afraid of the consequences. Yet here was the evidence, tangible proof of her emotional affair. Panic set in as she heard the familiar sound of the front door opening, signaling Mark's return home. Quickly, she slipped the phone into her pocket, her mind racing to come up with a plausible explanation. But as Mark entered the living room, his brow furrowed in concern, she knew the facade was crumbling. "Sarah, is everything all right? You look upset," he said, his voice laced with worry. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. I'm fine, Mark. Just a long day at work, that's all." The lie felt heavy on her tongue, and she averted her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. Mark approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You know you can talk to me, right? I'm here for you." Sarah's heart sank, the weight of her deception pressing down on her. How could she confess the truth? That she had been secretly meeting with David, that her heart had been slowly drifting away from the man she had once loved. The thought of losing the stability and security of her marriage terrified her, yet the pull of David's charismatic presence and the promise of a life beyond the confines of her routine was becoming increasingly irresistible. "I'm sorry, Mark," she whispered, the words barely audible. I've been struggling, and I haven't been honest with you." Mark's expression shifted from concern to confusion, and Sarah could see the hurt beginning to take root in his eyes. "What do you mean, Sarah? What haven't you been honest about?" Taking a deep breath, Sarah steeled herself for the confrontation. I've been seeing someone else. An old friend from college, David. We've been meeting up, and I... Her voice trailed off, the admission hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Mark's face fell, the color draining from his features. David? But how long has this been going on? His voice was strained, the betrayal evident in every word. It started a few weeks ago when he came back to town, Sarah confessed, her own eyes filling with tears. I didn't mean for it to happen, Mark. I never wanted to hurt you, but She paused, struggling to find the right words. I've been so unhappy, and David, he makes me feel alive again. Mark stepped back, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. So what? You're just going to throw away our marriage because you've got some romantic notion of being alive again? His voice rose in volume, the anger and hurt seeping through. Sarah flinched at his tone, the weight of her actions crashing down on her. I don't know, Mark. I'm so confused, and I need time to figure this out. Figure it out? Mark scoffed, his eyes narrowing. You're already halfway out the door, Sarah. How much more time do you need? He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks as she watched the man she had once loved crumble before her. I'm sorry, Mark. I never meant to hurt you, but I can't keep living a lie. I have to be true to myself, even if it means... She paused, the words catching in her throat. Even if it means letting you go. Mark's expression hardened, his jaw set in a tight line. So that's it, then? You're just going to leave me for him? He shook his head, the disbelief evident in his voice. I don't know, Mark. I need time to think, to figure out what I want, Sarah pleaded, her heart aching at the pain she was causing. Well, you better figure it out fast, Sarah, because I'm not going to wait around while you decide. With that, Mark turned and stormed out of the room, the sound of the front door slamming shut echoing through the house. Sarah sank onto the couch, her body trembling as the weight of her decision settled upon her. She had taken the first step, exposing the truth, but the consequences were far more devastating than she had anticipated. The future now hung in the balance, and she knew that the choice she made would irrevocably change the course of her life. Sarah stood at the edge of the park, the familiar surroundings enveloping her in a bittersweet embrace. This was the place where her friendship with David had blossomed, where they had shared laughter, dreams, and a connection that had transcended the boundaries of time and distance. Now it was here that she would make a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. The events of the past few days had left her reeling, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The confrontation with her husband, Mark, had been nothing short of devastating. The hurt and betrayal in his eyes had been like a knife to her heart, and she had struggled to find the words to explain the turmoil within her. As she walked the winding paths, the weight of her decision pressed heavily upon her. On one hand, there was the security and stability of her marriage, a life she had grown accustomed to, even if it had become stale and unfulfilling. Mark was a good man, and she knew that he loved her, even if their connection had faded over the years. But then there was David, the embodiment of the dreams and aspirations she had once held so dear. With him, she had experienced a level of excitement and passion that she had long forgotten. The weekend they had spent together had reignited a fire within her, a yearning for the freedom and adventure she had once craved. Sarah paused, her gaze drawn to the familiar bench where she and David had shared so many meaningful conversations. It was here that he had encouraged her to pursue her own happiness, to not let fear and societal expectations dictate the course of her life. His words had resonated with her, stirring a courage she had thought long buried. As she sat down, the memories of their time together flooded her mind. The laughter, the shared dreams, the way he had looked at her. It all came rushing back, filling her heart with a sense of longing and possibility. She thought of the life she had built with Mark, the comfortable routine they had fallen into. It was a life that had once seemed so secure, so stable. But now it felt like a cage, trapping her in a world that no longer aligned with her true desires. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing the sounds of the park to wash over her, the rustling of leaves, the distant laughter of children, the gentle breeze caressing her face. In this moment, she felt a clarity she had not experienced in years. She knew what she had to do. Opening her eyes, Sarah stood up with a newfound determination. She would not let fear and uncertainty hold her back any longer. She had spent too many years playing it safe, sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of societal expectations. With a deep breath, Sarah made her way back to her car, her steps filled with a sense of purpose. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that the consequences of her decision would be far-reaching. But in her heart, she knew that this was the path she needed to take. As she drove home, Sarah's mind raced with the implications of her choice. She would have to face Mark to explain her decision and the reasons behind it. It would be a difficult conversation, one filled with pain and heartbreak. But she was prepared to confront it, to take responsibility for her actions and the impact they would have on her marriage. When she arrived home, Mark was waiting for her, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions, hurt, confusion, and a glimmer of hope. Sarah took a deep breath and approached him, her voice steady and resolute. "Mark, we need to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Mark's expression shifted, his brow furrowing as he braced himself for what was to come. Sarah reached out and took his hands in hers, her gaze unwavering. "I've made a decision, and it's not an easy one, but I can't keep living this way, pretending that everything is fine when it's not." Mark's grip tightened, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. "What are you saying, Sarah?" "I'm saying that I can't stay in this marriage anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been unhappy for so long, and I've tried to ignore it, to convince myself that this is what I want. But it's not. I need to be true to myself, to pursue the happiness that I've been denying for too long." Tears welled up in Mark's eyes, and Sarah felt her heart break at the sight. "Is this because of David?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah nodded, unable to deny the truth. "Yes, it is. But it's more than that. It's about me, about finding the courage to live the life I want, not the one that's been expected of me." Mark's shoulders slumped, and he pulled his hands away, turning his back to her. Sarah could see the tension in his posture, the way his body shook with emotion. "I never thought you'd do this to me," he said, his voice barely audible. "I thought we had something special, something that would last forever." "I'm so sorry, Mark," Sarah said, her own tears now flowing freely. "I never meant to hurt you. But I can't keep living a lie. I have to be true to myself, even if it means letting you go." The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of their unspoken words hanging in the air. Sarah waited, her heart pounding, as Mark slowly turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed and his expression one of utter devastation. "If this is what you want," he said, his voice cracking, "then I won't stand in your way. But I want you to know that I'll always love you, Sarah, no matter what happens." With those words, Mark turned and walked away, leaving Sarah alone in the empty house, her heart heavy with the burden of her decision. But as she looked out the window, she saw the familiar figure of David waiting for her, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and hope. Taking a deep breath, Sarah opened the door and stepped out into the unknown, ready to embrace the future that lay before her.